He was still in his turnout gear when he walked through my door, and the first thing he said to me, covered in soot, smelling of smoke, at 6:15 in the morning, was, "Do you have anything with cardamom?" I want you to understand something about that sentence. I had been awake since 3 a.m. I had watched, from the window above my proofing rack, the eastern sky go orange in a way that had nothing to do with sunrise. I had spent the next 2 hours baking because baking is what I do when I cannot sleep and cannot look away from something I cannot fix. And then the door of my bakery had opened, the bell above it had rung, and a man in Firefighter turnout pants and a department-issued thermal layer, hood still around his neck, face streaked with ash, carrying his helmet under one arm like an afterthought, had walked in and asked me, with complete calm, if I had anything with cardamom. I did. I always do. Cardamom is not a Spokane staple, but it is mine. Cardamom and dark honey in a morning bun that I have been making since I opened this place 4 years ago, and that I make in the dark before anyone is awake. Because some things are better made in the quiet, I put one on the counter. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "Thank you. I've been smelling this place for 3 months and I finally had a reason to come in. I need you to stay with me," because what he meant by a reason is the part that changes everything. My name is Soren Aike. I'm 32 years old, and I own a bakery on a corner of South Perry Street in Spokane, Washington, in the kind of neighborhood that used to be overlooked and is now the kind of place people move to on purpose. Old Craftsman houses, a farmer's market on Thursdays, the specific quality of light in the inland Northwest that hits differently than anywhere else I've lived, flatter and clearer, like the air has fewer opinions about itself. I opened Ayaki's 4 years ago with my savings, a lease I probably shouldn't have signed, and the conviction that Spokane deserved a serious bakery in a neighborhood that walked to things. I was right about that at least. I am in by 3 a.m., 6 days a week. I know my regulars by order before they open their mouths. I know the street outside my window at every hour, who walks it, when, what the light does to the brick of the building across from me at 7 a.m. in October when the frost is still on the sidewalk. What I had not fully registered in 3 months of knowing my street was the fire station 4 blocks east, or the man who apparently ran past my corner every morning at 5:15 and had been doing so, I would later learn, since August. His name is Brennan Ó Ceallaigh, Irish-American, 3rd-generation Spokane, the kind of name that nobody spells right on the first try, including me, which he seemed to find genuinely funny when I attempted it on the paper bag I wrote it on for his order. He is 35 years old and has been with Spokane Fire Department for 11 years, currently assigned to Station 1 on Riverside, the oldest station in the city. He walked into my bakery on a Thursday in November at 6:15 in the morning because the building 2 blocks north of me, a vacant commercial property on the corner of 17th and Perry, had caught fire at 4 a.m. and burned for 2 hours before. His crew got it controlled, and on the walk back to the engine, he had passed my window and seen my light and smelled what I was making and decided, apparently, that 3 months of running past was enough. I did not know any of this yet. I just knew there was a man in my bakery at 6:15 who smelled of smoke and wanted cardamom, and was looking at me the way people look at something they've been thinking about for longer than they've admitted. He came back the next morning, not in turnout gear, in civilian clothes, a Spokane FD quarter zip, and running shoes. 40 minutes after his shift ended, he ordered the cardamom bun again and a black coffee and sat at the counter, which nobody does at 6 in the morning because the counter is for me, for my prep, for the particular quiet of early work. He sat there anyway, not intrusively, just present, as if he had assessed the space and determined that the counter was the right place and was proceeding accordingly. I let him. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it was the cardamom. You were baking at 3 this morning, he said. Not a question. I'm always baking at 3, I said. I know, he said. I've run past here since August. The light's always on. I looked at him. He looked at me. He had very direct eyes, not aggressive, not performing anything, just direct. The way some people are direct when they've spent enough time in situations where indirectness costs something. You've been running past my bakery for 3 months, I said. 4, he said. Since August. And yesterday was the first time you came in. I needed a reason, he said. I told you. A building fire is a reason. It put me on your block, he said. I decided to stop making excuses. And that, right there, is when I understood I was in trouble. He became a regular with a speed that surprised me, though in retrospect, it shouldn't have. Brennan Ó Ceallaigh, I would learn, does not do things tentatively. He runs 4 miles before most people are awake. He has been in the same fire station for 8 years because he believes in knowing a place completely before moving on. He reads actual books with a bookmark, not a phone. And he has opinions about bread that are more developed than most people's opinions about bread, which I found both suspicious and deeply appealing. He would come in after his morning run on his off days, or after a shift on the days he worked, always in that window, between 6 and 7, before the neighborhood fully woke up, when the bakery was mine, and the light was still low, and the day hadn't committed to anything yet. He'd sit at the counter. He'd order the same thing for 6 weeks, and then one morning ask about the fig and black pepper loaf I was testing, and eat half of it standing up at the counter, while I watched him think about it. More pepper, he said. Not a lot, just enough so you know it's there. That's a very specific opinion, I said. I have specific opinions about most things, he said. He looked at me. You do too. I'm a baker, I said. It's professionally required. It's more than professional, he said quietly, and went back to the bread. I stood at my counter and felt something I hadn't felt in a while. The specific warmth of being correctly seen. Here's what I didn't know yet. He was already looking into the fire. The building that burned on 17th and Perry was the 3rd vacant commercial fire in the South Perry neighborhood in 14 months. The first 2 had been ruled accidental. Faulty wiring in neglected properties, the kind of thing that happens in buildings nobody is maintaining. The 3rd one, Brennan's Cruise Fire, had a different signature. The fire investigator found pour patterns on the subfloor, accelerant traces near 2 separate origin points. Someone had set it deliberately. Brennan told me this on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after he first walked through my door, which was both a sign of how quickly we had arrived at a certain kind of ease with each other, and in retrospect, a sign of how much the investigation was occupying him. The pattern is moving south, he said. He was looking at his coffee. First fire was on 14th, second on 15th and a half, third on 17th, he paused. South Perry runs south. I looked at him. I'm not trying to alarm you, he said. I wanted you to know, because you're here at 3 in the morning, and the building directly across from you has been vacant for 8 months, and He stopped. You're worried about my block, I said. I'm worried about you, he said. Straightforward. No performance. Just the fact of it. Stated plainly. I had been alone in this bakery at 3 in the morning for 4 years, without anyone worrying about it. I had not understood, until that moment, how that felt different from someone worrying about it. Okay, I said. Okay, he said. He looked up. I'm going to ask the investigator to extend the perimeter. It's a reasonable precaution. Professionally, I said. And personally, he said. The directness again, the eyes that didn't look away. Both. That word. Both. I kept it. The arson investigation ran through November and into December. Brennan was not the lead investigator. That was the fire marshal's office. But as the crew captain on the 3rd scene, he was deeply involved. And I watched him work it the way I had watched him work everything, methodically, completely, with the particular focus of someone who does not let a problem go until it resolves. He started coming in twice a day on his off shifts, morning, and then again, in the afternoon, ostensibly to update me on the investigation's perimeter status, which I was aware was not a standard service provided by Spokane Fire Department to individual business owners. I did not mention this. He did not explain it. We existed in the comfortable fiction of the professional check-in for about 2 weeks before it became something else, simply by the weight of accumulated honesty. One afternoon in late November, he came in when the bakery was empty and sat at the counter and didn't say anything for a while, just drank his coffee and watched me shape a batch of sourdough. And at some point, I looked up and he was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the focused assessment he usually wore, but something quieter, something less managed. "You okay?" I said. He considered the question the way he considered everything, fully, without rushing it. "The investigator found a fourth origin site today," he said. "Not a fire, a planned one. They got to it before it was set." "Where?" He looked at me steadily. "Half a block from here." The bakery was very quiet. "Brennan," I said. "They have a suspect," he said. "They're moving on it tonight. It's going to be okay." He put his coffee down. "I needed to be here. I don't know how else to say that." I put down the dough. I came around the counter. I sat on the stool next to him, not across from him, next to him. And the distance between us was about 6 inches, and neither of us moved to change it. "You've been watching my block since November," I said. "August," he said. "Different reasons in August?" "What were the reasons in August?" He turned to look at me. 6 inches, his face fully in the afternoon light that comes through my west window at 4 o'clock and turns everything, the color of the bread I pull from the oven, warm and specific and not quite like anything else. "You," he said. Simply, completely. I had been waiting for that word since the morning he asked about cardamom. I just hadn't known it until he said it. I reached out and put my hand over his on the counter. Not dramatically, not after a long pause. Just put it there. Because it was the true thing to do. And Brennan Ó Ceallaigh had been teaching me, over 3 months of early mornings, that the true thing done directly is almost always the right thing. He turned his hand over. We sat like that in my bakery in the November afternoon light, the sourdough waiting on the bench, the street outside quiet, the smell of the day's baking still in the air, dark honey, cardamom, the particular warmth of a room where something good has been made all day. "I've never dated anyone who gets up at 3 in the morning," he said. "Eventually. I've never dated anyone who runs 4 miles before I open," I said. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We will," I said. And that was it. Not a declaration, not a climax, just 2 people in a warm room in November, having already done all the hard work of being honest, arriving at the part where they got to just be. By January, we had a system. He would end his overnight shifts at 6 and come directly to my counter, still in his department quarter zip, and I would have his order ready before he asked. Cardamom bun, black coffee, and whatever I was testing that week, because he had become my most reliable palate, the one I trusted to tell me the true thing without softening it. In return, he would sit at the counter and tell me about the shift. Not the difficult parts, usually, just the texture of it, the small human moments that accumulate in 11 years of emergency work. And I would listen while I shaped or scored or loaded the oven, and the bakery would be warm around us, and the street outside would wake up slowly, and it was the best part of my day. The arson suspect was arrested in December. 4 fires, 1 prevented. Nobody had been hurt. The South Perry neighborhood exhaled collectively and went back to its farmers, markets, and craftsman renovations, and the particular self-satisfaction of a neighborhood that knows it is good and is right about that. My building across the street was inspected and cleared. The owner started renovation in January. By March, there was a pottery studio going in on the ground floor. Brennan was at my counter the morning the pottery studio sign went up. He saw it through the window and said nothing for a moment, just looked at it and then looked at me. Better neighbor than a vacant building, he said. Significantly, I said. He looked at me for another moment. I'm glad you were here, he said. When I came in that morning, you came in because of a fire, I said. I came in because I'd been running past your light for 4 months, he said, and I finally stopped making excuses. He paused. The fire just moved the timeline. I looked at him across the counter. This man who ran toward burning things, who had watched my block through a Spokane autumn without making it strange, who asked for cardamom at 6 in the morning and meant something else entirely by it. The timeline worked out, I said. Yeah, he said. It did. He reached across the counter, his hand, briefly, at my jaw, warm from the coffee cup, the gesture he'd first made on a November afternoon when we were 6 inches apart and the light was the color of bread. Quick. Certain. His. More cardamom tomorrow? He said. Always? I said. He smiled. The full one. The real one. The one I'd been cataloging since November and never got tired of, and finished his coffee and went home to sleep, and I went back to my dough, and the street outside filled up with morning, the way it does in Spokane in winter. Slowly, quietly, with that flat clear light that has no opinions about itself. I have been here since 3 in the morning. I will be here tomorrow at 3. He will come in at 6. The light will be on. It always is.